In this video, I want to continue developing an understanding of what percentage of increase and percentage of decrease means. And as we go through these little examples here, you might want to pause the video and see if you can come up with what my percentage of change is for each of these examples. So I'm going to start off with an easier ones, and then I'm going to kind of work my way up from there. So let's say that my original amount was 100. So 100 units. I'm not going to be specific with this. You can think of it as $100 or, 100 seashells, whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. My new amount, let's say my new amount. So I'm starting with 100 and then I'm going to 160. Let's say 100 baseball cards, and now I have 160 baseball cards. My amount of change would just be how much did I go up from here to here? And in this case, if I start with 100 and I end with 160, basically I've gained 60 units. Now, what is that as a percent? And this is a nice, easy one because of my starting amount being 100. A percentage of change is how much am I gaining for every 100. Well, since I started with exactly 100, my percentage of change would just be 60%. And whenever you're dealing with percent of increase and percent of decrease, you want to be very clear as to which one it is. So in this case, this is a 60% increase. All right, let's take a look at another example. Once again, let's start with 100. And let's say that this time, instead of gaining, I'm going to lose something. Okay, so let's say I started with my 100 baseball cards, and now I'm down to 70. So what is my amount of change? Well, this time, because I'm losing 30, I'm going to put negative right here. So I'm going down 30. That's my amount of change. What is my percent of change? How much am I losing for every 100? Well, I'm losing 30. So this would be a 30%. And in this case, because I'm going down, I would want to call that a 30% decrease. I'm losing 30 for every 100 that I start with. Now, one thing I want to mention here quickly is that as you work through this, you're going to find that you have to work with two different ideas at the same time. Idea number one being how much do you go up and how much do you go down? Idea number two, how much do you now have after going up that amount or going down that amount? So in this first example, this was a 60% increase. Another way to look at that is I could say I have 160% of what I started with. So let's actually write that. So I'll write that over here. So in this one, I ended up with 160% of my original. So my original was 100. 100% of that is all of it, so that's 100. So I don't have 100% of my original. I have even more than that. I have 160% of my original. In this one, I went down. I lost 30. In this one, I would say that I'm ending up with 70% of my original. So there's two different percents here, and this is something that you're going to have to be very careful with as we work through this section, because I've had a lot of students in the past get confused between these two ideas. Idea number one being that I lost 30%. It was a 30% decrease. Idea number two being that after I lost that 30%, I now have 70% of what I started with. Let's take a look at another one. Let's make it a little more challenging instead of having 100 here at the beginning. So let's say I start with 50 and my new amount is going to be 65. So what is my amount of change? How much did I go up? Well, in this case, I went up 15 units. Now, what is my percentage of change? Well, I'm going up 15 for every 50 that I start with, and going up 15 for every 50 is going to be exactly the same thing as going up 30 for every 100. So this one is actually a 30% change, and because I'm going up, I would want to say that this is a 30% increase. Okay. Now, in terms of what percent of my original do I have, I now have 130% of my original. So 100% of my original would be all 50 that I started with, but I have even more than that. I have 130% of my original. All right, let's do another one. This time, let's start with 25. My new amount, let's make it 23. My amount of change, how much did I go down? Well, in this case, I went down 2. So if I am going down 2 for every 25, if you multiply the top and the bottom of this by 4, you'll see that that is the same thing as losing 8 for every 100. And because I'm losing 8, I would want to call this an 8% decrease. After that 8% decrease, I now have 92% of my original. So I started with 25, I ended with 23. What I ended up with was 92% of what I started with. Another one. Let's say I had 70 to start with. And let's say that my new amount was 50. My amount of change from 70 to 50 is that I went down 20 units. Now, you'll notice that unlike the previous examples, the percentage of change isn't quite as friendly. So going down 20 for every 70, what does that mean in terms of every 100? I can divide the top and bottom by 10, and I can say that I'm losing 2 out of every 7, but it's not quite as easy to see how much am I losing for every 100. And one thing that's kind of neat here is that a way to think of this is, let's go back to these previous ones. When I had 15 out of every 50, I said that was the same thing as 30 out of every 100. Well, if I just divided these numbers, 30 divided by 100, that would be 0.3. As a percent, 3/10 is 30 hundredths or 30%. On this one, if I take -2 divided by 25, that is the same thing as taking -8 divided by 100, which would be 0.08. That's the decimal form. My percentage form is 8%. So one way to do this is to just divide. -2 divided by 7. So let's do that. So if I take 2, divide that by 7, I get 0.28. I'll round this. This is 0.286. So let's write that down. This is 0.286 approximately. So as a percent, that would be about, once again, I rounded this, about 28.6%. Now, because I went down, this is another one where I want to say, okay, this is a decrease. This is a 28.6% decrease. Now, what percent of my original do I have? Okay, so if I started with 100%, whatever I start with is all of it. That's my whole. It's 100%. If I lost 20, that would knock me down to 80. I lost another 8. That would put me down to 72. And then I lost another 0.6. So I am ending up with 71.4% of my original. And of course, another way to think through this is, if you think of this as a proportion, you could cross multiply here. You could do 7 times x is 7x. Negative 2 times 100 would be negative 200. So I would have 7x equals negative 200. And the negative is just telling me that it's a decrease. You can almost throw that out and just write the word decrease, and that takes care of that idea. But anyway, just to finish this up, if I take negative 200 divided by 7, that should give me that negative 28.6 number. So let's do that. Negative 200 divided by 7. I'm not sure if I can type in a negative here. I can't. I'm just going to do 200 divided by 7 and then realize that's what the negative, that is in there. So it's negative 28.6. Let's do one more example and then we'll wrap this up. Let's go with some really crazy numbers here and see if we can think this through. Let's say that my original number was, let's say it's 324. So now I have 324 baseball cards, and let's say that my new amount is, I don't know, let's go something big. This will be a big increase. Let's do 829. Okay, so I started with 324. I'm ending up with 829. This is a pretty substantial increase. 100% increase would mean that I've doubled my amount that I have. So if I went from 324 to 648, that would be 100% increase. So here, let's add this up off to the side. So 324 plus 324, that was 648. That would be 100% increase. Let's add another 324 on top of that. That would be a 200% increase. So let's see what I end up with there. And that would give me 972 for a 200% increase. So this 829 is just kind of thinking this through a little bit. This is somewhere between 100 and a 200% increase. All right, let's actually calculate what it is. So what's my amount of change? How much did I go up? 324 plus what number would give me 829? Well, if I subtract these two, I'll know what that is. So 9 minus 4 is 5, 2 minus 2 is 0. So my increase was 505. So I am gaining 505 for every 324 that I started with. So let's work that out. So 505 divided by 324, and it's a 100. 50, about 56, so 1.558. So let's write that number down. So this is about 1.558, which is, as a percent, this would be about, we'll round the 8, rounds the 5 up to a 6. This is about a 156% increase, which means that if I'm gaining 156%, I now am ending up with, I now have 256% of my original. Okay, so I hope that going through that activity just gives you some kind of intuition of what it means to have a percentage of increase or a percentage of decrease.